Well, now it's time for Night Waves with Philip Dodd.
Yesterday was a day of strange meetings, full of unexpected moments. 2 interviews, one with Noam Chomsky, to some commentators the world's most famous public intellectual, the other with Anthony Selden, historian of contemporary Britain and master of Wellington College, a college founded in 1859. 2 very different figures, one profoundly sceptical of authority, another, by dint of his title, its upholder. Both interviewees upended my expectations at moments. I had presumed an explosive Noam Chomsky, here to give the Edward Said lecture on the Middle East, spittingly anti-American, capable of Manichaean judgments of good and of evil. It turned out rather different. Noam Chomsky is now 84, and he came initially to prominence over 50 years ago as a major new voice in linguistics. But from the 1960s onwards, he has become perhaps now the dissenting voice in the US, damning his country for what he sees as its crimes, from Vietnam to its support of Israel. Noam Chomsky comes from an activist American Jewish immigrant family, so no surprise how he has developed. But what is arresting is a sentence in an early 1967 essay, Resistance, where he speaks of his innate distaste for activism. Odd for an American whose global reputation rests exactly on his activist writings and actions, I said when we met in a small bedroom in St Pancras Hotel in London yesterday.
If the world would go away, I'd be happy to do work that's intellectually challenging and exciting, but the world doesn't go away. So you're compelled to do things that wouldn't be my choice. I'm kind of a hermit, basically.
Was there a moment when you made the choice, or do you think the choice was made for you? Do you think history gave you this role, whether you like it or not?
I thought about it. I mean, first of all, I had been a youth activist, so I knew what was involved. But the period of the 1950s, it was a kind of a quiet period. Not much was happening, and I was mostly doing my work, writing and so on. By about 1960 or 61, things were beginning to ferment in various domains, civil rights, Vietnam War, other issues, and I did make a very conscious choice. I mean, I was aware that when you put your toe in it, pretty soon you're going to be immersed. So it's nothing that you can do a little bit of if you're serious about it. And I had a kind of a nice life. I had a young family, had a tenured university position at a place that I liked a lot. Fields was developing very well, and I understood very well that I'd give up things. Do I want to do it? Well, kind of made a choice. It was a very conscious choice.
What was your instinctive distaste? I'm interested in that. This is a kind of psychological thing for you, is it? You don't like the glare of the spotlight.
It's the same distaste that keeps me from going to parties, for example. I just don't feel comfortable with big groups. Rather be alone or in a library with 1 or 2 friends or something like that. It goes back all the way.
Well, I want to talk about going back, if we can, in 2 ways. Your linguistic work, but also in a way I think your political work comes out of a loyalty to the Enlightenment. I know nobody more than you who's committed yourself to the kind of clear light of reason from the 60s onward. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I would be happy to consider myself a child of the Enlightenment. If I could go back to some period in history in my next existence, it might be, say, Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment. It'd be nice to meet David Hume and Adam Smith and others.
What would you say to them?
That's a good question. I would tell Hume that his essay on national character was terrible. Although for the time, not too bad.
I'd love to hear Hume's response to that. I suppose what I feel is, in those early 60s essays, or those mid-60s essays, you planted your flag about reason. You've kept going with reason. And one way of reading the last 40 years, and some of the times when you write about it, there have been all kinds of defeats. You know, in the Occupy book, which was published last year, you say the objective conditions may be worse than they were in the 30s. How much has your belief in reason been eroded by history?
Not at all. Whatever happens doesn't affect the question of whether you should try to deal with the world rationally or irrationally. I don't see that as a choice.
But you know, there's a response to that, says if the world does not respond to reason, and I always think I think you were about 40 in 1968, so you're not a 68 guy. You're not at all. The eruption of the surrealist unconscious into everyday life is...
I wasn't part of it, you know. In fact, I didn't like the music, didn't like the noise. I liked the young people. They were good people, but I couldn't be part of what they were doing.
Reason overrides every moment in history, does it? Your loyalty to it. It has to be.
If you care about human beings and their fate, and you want to do something to help them, or if you care about discovering significant aspects of the universe or human nature or whatever it may be, you have no choice. It's either be rational and maybe make some progress, or be irrational, make things worse.
Okay, then I want to ask, one of the reasons I like the collection of essays on Occupy, you bring back into American discourse a word that's sometimes hard to find, which is class. And you say very clearly that Occupy is arguably the first major eruption of class feeling, the 1% and the 99% in 30 years. You were a child of the 30s in certain kinds of ways. Now, I suppose I tell myself, reason didn't, in the first instance, make him feel loyal to a class. You don't feel loyal to a class for rational reasons.
I feel a duty and responsibility to people who are suffering and need help needlessly, whom we can do something about. Now, it happens that that's a class-related choice, but it need not be class. It can be indigenous people. I mean, I've spent time working with poor campesinos in southern Colombia whose lives are being destroyed by mining, fumigation, terror. I don't know what class they are. They're just indigenous people, Afro-Colombians, campesinos, and the same elsewhere. If I go to a refugee camp in, say, Beirut, and see the conditions under which people live, the effort to do something for them is not a class-related matter. But it happens that in industrial societies like ours, relatively rich ones, there are very sharp class differentiations which are suppressed and ought to be brought out.
So it's not a matter of your politics of what I would call identification, or what Raymond Williams might have called social consciousness. This is this is when you sound to a European most American. Mm-hmm. It's much more an individual, rational response to injustice.
I think you're right about the distinction. It's one of the things I prefer about American culture.
We'll come back to that in a moment. I want to ask you now about something else that you mention in the Occupy book, which is at one moment you say, given the decimation of American industry, you mentioned that Obama's sending his Minister of State over to Spain to order high-speed trains, and you say this could easily have been done in the Rust Belt.
It was particularly striking because I forget whether I said it there, but this was at the time when Obama had largely nationalized the auto industry, and there were some choices. One choice, the one that was taken, was to reconstruct it with public funds and support and hand it back to pretty much the old owners, maybe different faces, but the same class, and have it continue to do what it had been doing in the past. There were other choices. One choice, for example, would have been to hand it over to the workforce in the communities and help them produce things that are needed in the country. I mean, it's an absolute scandal that you can go from, say, China to Kazakhstan in a high-speed rail, but you can't go from Boston to New York in a high-speed rail. It's harmful to people, it's harmful to the economy, it's maybe good for car manufacturers and energy industries and banks and so on, but that could have been done, and that would have also had, in my view, a kind of a revolutionary impact in bringing about changes in the nature of the society, healthy changes.
There is another response to that, and you're now going to play European and North American for the next however long it lasts. The defence there of American workers, which is entirely honourable, neglects, of course, that one of the consequences of the outsourcing by capitalism, it's what Marx, as you would know, would call a contradiction, is the raising of between 300 and 400 million Chinese peasants from absolute poverty into some kind of living standard. And capitalism's very complex.
Well, I don't think it does that. I'm all in favor of raising the Chinese workforce to decent standards, but I'd say that we should do it the way they want, not the way the management of Apple wants. And it happens to be very different. So at Foxconn, say, there's constant strike, there's labor actions constantly, huge number of strikes, trying to get decent working conditions.
And they're getting them.
No, they're barely getting them.
No, listen, 20% in the last year is basic.
Going from from horror to slightly less horror. So I'd say, yes, that's what we should be engaged in. It's not capitalism that's doing it. It's the struggle against capitalism. And I think, yes, we should be part of that.
But I suppose what I'm saying is to center so much of your thoughts on the American working class. And I know you're American.
I don't. I've written about Chinese workers and their struggles and what we should do about them. I mean, from where I'm sitting in Boston, I can't do much about labor actions in southwestern China. I can write about them, talk about them, and so on. But I think we should support them. And it has nothing to do with exporting jobs. We can help.
But historically it has been. You and I may not like it, or you may not like it. I'm dispassionate, of course, in my circumstances. But that's what's happened.
Well, look, a lot of things have happened. For example, genocide. That doesn't mean I'm in favor of it.
It's not a good analogy.
It is a good analogy. There are things that are happening all over. I think we would like to see them happen differently. So we should therefore act in such a way as to help them happen differently. If there are massive labor struggles in China, yeah, we should help them. And if it turns out that rearranging the job choices will help them, okay. But there is a question. Who makes those decisions? I mean, it's not up to me. It's not up to the management of Apple. It's up to the workforce and the communities.
But those communities now have to be global. That's where you and I...
Fine. That's why unions are called internationals for that reason. Yes, it has to be global. And when, say, the United Steelworkers begins to make an arrangement with Mondragon and the Basque Country, I think that's a good idea. Who's going to make the decisions and for what purpose? Well, those are the questions. I think the decisions ought to be made democratically, not autocratically, and they ought to be designed not for profit, but for need and for decent human lives.
How do we get from is to ought? How do we get from where we are? Because the problem for the left, of which you are distinguished...
Plenty of ways. I mean, we just mentioned one. For example, if there had been a powerful Occupy-type movement, a popular movement in the United States at the time of this nationalization of the auto industry and going to Spain. If there had been such a movement, it could have pressed for quite a different response. And that happens all the time. Like I forget whether I mentioned it there, but right about the same time in the Occupy, there's a talk there given in the Boston Occupy movement. And I brought up cases right in near Boston, towns where workers were attempting to take over a profitable enterprise that the multinational that owned it wanted to get rid of. And the multinational preferred to get rid of it, not to allow it to be worker managed. And I said, look, this is something we can get involved in right now.
And I agree, but you've just used that most complex of tenses, and I now speak to a linguist, which is the subjunctive. Okay, if.
Yes.
So the big question
So therefore, let's construct the movements which will be able to do it. And they are doing it.
You believe, no, I mean, I suppose that's really what I'm asking you. You know, Occupy is there, but do you really believe it's doing it? One of the things that keeps tolling through you're a good 30s man because you believe in hard work. Whenever you speak to people, you always say, it's got to be hard work, it's got to be long, it's difficult, there are lots of defeats on the way. It's hard to think from the time you began your activism that we're getting nearer, or are we getting further away?
History goes in many directions. So in many respects, the United States, England, other countries are a lot more civilized than they were in the 1960s. That's because of activism. In some ways, there's been a reaction to that, and in some ways there's regression. Okay, that turns it backwards. But it's not a simple matter. That's the way progress is made. That's
slow, difficult, provisional, always.
If there's any other way, I've never heard of it. Yeah.
So revolution isn't on the agenda. Slow, painful, complex reform is.
Well, you know, a revolution could be on the agenda if the great mass of the population...
That's subjunctive again.
Well, you're asking when revolution could be on the agenda, and there's a condition for it. The condition is if it's going to be a constructive revolution, not a revolution towards some kind of dictatorship or autocracy. It can happen constructively when a large mass of the population understands, recognizes that they cannot achieve just goals that they want within the current framework of institutions.
That takes us very nicely, sometimes broadcasters say that, takes us very nicely to the Middle East, which is why you're here in London. Do you think what is happening in the Middle East is some kind of transformative moment? Because you're over here where in effect you're still saying, and I want us to come on to that the US and its allies still play a very big role.
Oh, enormous. Less than they did.
I was going to say, do they play now the determining role one might argue that they played 30 years ago?
No, in fact, US power has been declining since 1945. American power reached its peak at the end of the Second World War. The US had half the world's wealth. Other industrial societies were devastated. Security was unimaginable. And there were plans to reconstruct the world under the American aegis. They were very detailed plans. They were then implemented. Marshall Plan was part of it. By 1949, it was falling apart.
So then you know the response to that. Since American power's been declining since 49, why has Noam Chomsky spent the best parts of his life railing against a declining power?
I'm not railing against the declining power. I'm railing against the crimes that it carries out.
But
not against the decent things that it does. And yes, it's still by far the most, overwhelmingly the most powerful country in the world. I mean, take the Middle East. It's interesting to compare it with what happened in Latin America over the past 10 years. You go back 20 years ago, Latin America was what was called the backyard, completely under control. If anything got out of control, the U.S. invaded, put in a dictatorship, familiar story. The last roughly 10 or 15 years, Latin America has extricated itself from the system of external domination, first European and American, to a remarkable extent. Actually, there was a striking illustration of that just a couple of weeks ago. You perhaps saw the study by the Open Society Institute of Rendition called Globalizing Torture. It's the globalized torture campaign that the U.S. has been running. Well, other countries participate. And it was a study of the countries that participated. Most of Europe, Middle East, that's where the torture was going on. You send them to dictatorships, Asia, Africa. One region was totally out, nothing, Latin America, which is remarkable. First, because Latin America had been just taken for granted as utterly subordinate to the U.S., But also during this long period, Latin America was one of the torture centers of the world. But now they won't participate. That's an uprising. And U.S. and I'm sure British planners are deeply concerned that the so-called MENA countries, Middle East, North Africa, might move in the same direction.
Well, I was going to say, when you say it is the most important player, it's not the most important player in Egypt as it was once under Mubarak. After all, Obama took a long time to sign up to the anti-Mubarak
It's a little misleading. I mean, there's a standard procedure when your favorite dictator's in trouble, dozens of cases. Somoza, Marcos, Suharto, a long list. What you do is you support him as long as possible. When it becomes impossible because, say, the army turns against him, you send him off somewhere.
It doesn't look as though Mubarak is being sent anywhere soon.
He's, as a person, he's gone. But the next thing that you do, of course, issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy. But the next thing you do is try to restore the old order as much as possible, and that's just what's happening.
But I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood anytime soon are going to become a puppet for American imperialism, and you don't either.
Well, that's not entirely true.
You mean you do believe that?
It's not a... Look, Mubarak wasn't a puppet for American imperialism either. He was carrying out the kind of programs that the U.S. approved of. For example, the neoliberal economic programs. And the Brotherhood's doing the same thing. So yes, Mubarak, for example, was punishing the people of Gaza. Morsi's doing the same thing. So it's not a matter of somebody holding a puppet by a noose. Support harsh regimes or any kind of regime if they're doing the kind of things you like.
But then it seems to me you're still... I liked what you said earlier much better, but that's my privilege and yours to disagree, which is that American power's been declining. It's an economic power.
It's not different. It's just, it's declining and it's still overwhelming. There's no other...
So what is it doing, or what can it do, or what should it do in Syria?
In Syria? Well, I think it's clear what it shouldn't, what it actually is doing in not doing in Syria is probably pretty much the right stand. I mean, it could give humanitarian aid, like there have been a lot of pledges of humanitarian aid, and they simply haven't come through. And there's no justification for that. It's desperately needed. On the other hand, what Britain and France are doing, in my view, is likely to make it worse for the reasons that have been discussed by just about everyone who knows Syria well. Patrick Coburn a couple of days ago, Charles Glass, Jonathan Steele, others.
So this is one of those few moments when America is preferable to Britain and France.
Not the only one. Britain and France have horrible records. I don't have to go through that.
I was going to say, listen, I want to ask you two last questions, if I may. And they relate to your stance more generally. And I want, since you're here in London, you know, you've made loyal the notion of freedom of expression. You've got into all kinds of trouble because of freedom of expression. Today, the British Parliament will vote on statutory legislation for the media. Would you be in favour of it?
Not really. Here,
it's your American.
I'm an American again. I do believe in freedom of expression.
It's got no bounds.
Oh yeah, everything has bounds. There are no absolute moral principles. But I think it carries, any limitations on it carry a very strong burden of proof. And in Britain, in my view, it's scandalous, not the Leveson inquiry. Things like the British libel laws are international scandal, in my opinion. And they've been used to shut down newspapers, to silence people. I mean, I can see myself if I have a book that's being published in the United States and it's going to appear in England, since it's going to appear in England, it has to go through a battery of lawyers to see if it's going to violate these crazy libel laws.
So you'd change certain things, but you wouldn't have statutory regulation for the media. It offends your Americanism, doesn't it?
You have to see exactly what the regulation is. As I say, I don't think you can state an absolute principle. Like there's some things that journals shouldn't do. Just how that should be controlled is another question.
Like what? I mean, because you got yourself into a lot of trouble in the 70s writing an essay in a book by someone who denied the Holocaust, and the reason you argued is you thought he had the right to say it.
Well, actually, first of all, I didn't get into a lot of trouble. I got into no trouble. Secondly,
you got into trouble with some of the French.
Oh yeah, they didn't like it. Secondly, I didn't write anything for the book. And thirdly, the book didn't deny the Holocaust. So we should first get the data correct.
Okay, but Faurisson was a Holocaust denier.
At that time, it wasn't even raised. In fact, he came to trial a couple of years later, and he was condemned. I thought it was outrageous. But the issue of Holocaust denial didn't even come up.
But I suppose the issue I'm asking you, okay,
let's make it subjunctive again.
Let's make, I was going to say,
suppose somebody,
you have?
Yes, I do it all the time, right in the United States. In the United States, in my view, fortunately, there are university professors with tenure, I could name them if you like, who write big hardcover books, widely published, denying the Holocaust. And nobody pays the slightest attention to them. I think that's correct. And if there were any attempt to suppress them, I'd object to it.
This individual, you can see it sticks in the craw of the European, this commitment to a kind of individual position. I want to ask you a last question, if I may, which is the question of authority. I dug out from King Lear's great quote when he's on the heath, "There thou mightst behold the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office." Where does authority lie for you? Is it purely in the individual conscience determined by rationalism?
It's very much like freedom of speech. Authority, hierarchy, and domination have a burden of proof. They have to demonstrate their legitimacy. They are not self-justifying. If there's any structure of hierarchy and domination, whether it's in a patriarchal family, in international society, anywhere in between, it has to justify itself. Sometimes it can. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street with my granddaughter, 3-year-old granddaughter, and she starts to run into the street, and I grab her hand and pull her back, that's coercive authority, but I think I can give a justification for it. Most times you can't give a justification, and when it can't, it ought to be dismantled.
One last question to you. We started by you saying you had no choice. In a sense, history determined that you took the role you did. You took a choice, but history kind of pushed you there. One of the things, and this is the American in you again, I always feel your great strength is that sense that you can volunteer for things. I think there's much less in you, which is the European, of how you're volunteered for things, how you're determined. Men make history. That's the first part of the sentence, which Americans understand, but not in the conditions of their own making, is the second part, which Europeans understand. Do you really think your role is a voluntary one? It's chosen?
For all of us. The same in Europe. If Émile Zola wanted to defend Dreyfus, that was a choice. He wasn't forced to do it. If Bertrand Russell decided to oppose the First World War and go to jail, that was a choice. A lot of things happen. I mean, take the American Civil Rights Movement, 1965, the Voter Rights Act. Did Lyndon Johnson lead the troops? No. Did Martin Luther King lead the troops? No. What happened was there was things like a couple of black kids sitting at a lunch counter, freedom riders, young freedom riders, going through the South to try to register voters, very brutal and bitter mass demonstrations, and then that created a situation in which individuals could appear who would articulate what was happening, as Martin Luther King did very effectively.
So where is Noam Chomsky in the resistance? Is he there towards the back? Is he at the side? Is he at the front?
There was a popular resistance movement going on. I participated in it the way I could. I couldn't do it the way, say, an 18-year-old was. I couldn't refuse to go to fight in Vietnam because I wasn't the right age, but I could do other things. And in fact, ended up pretty close to a long prison sentence, but not participating the way the people in the lead were participating. I didn't get exiled for the rest of my life, as many young people did.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky. And if you want to see and hear his Edward Said lecture, you can find out details on the Nightwaves website. The lecture took place last night. You're listening to Nightwaves with me, Philip Dodd, in a special edition where I consult authorities about power, reason and ethics.